Dwellers on the Nile: The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians by E. A. Wallis Budge continues with chapter 10. Is this the last chapter? Yeah, this is the last chapter. The Egyptian Dead, Heaven and Hell, the Future Life. The Egyptians of the Neolithic period believed that their existence would not come to an end with the death of their bodies, and they appear to have thought that the renewed life which they would live in some unknown region would closely resemble that which they were accustomed to lead in this world. This proved to be the fact that in the oldest known pre-dynastic graves, pots containing food, flint weapons for war and the chase, flint tools, etc., have been found in considerable numbers. The belief in immortality which is attested by these objects never diminished, but, on the contrary, developed and increased throughout the whole period of dynastic history. The Neolithic Egyptians, who could afford to bury their dead and did not cast their bodies out into the desert for wild beasts to devour, dug oval, shallow graves for them on the edges of their desert. The cultivatable land was then, as it had been in all periods, far too valuable to devote to the dead. The body was buried in the bent or prenatal position and was wrapped sometimes in a reed mat and sometimes in the skin of some animal, perhaps a gazelle, and the grave was covered over more or less carefully. The dryness of the soil and the absence of wind enabled the body to retain its form as it gradually dried. In some graves, the unleashed bones of the skeleton are found, but by what means they were unfleshed is unknown. Many modern African peoples take their dead out in the forest, and when the ants have cleaned the bones, collect them and bury them, or otherwise preserve them. Other graves were covered over with large earthenware pots, and later still bodies were laid in boxes of various shapes, which are prototypes of the coffin. The pre-dynastic Egyptians made no attempt to mummify their dead, and there was no necessity for them to do so, for the dryness of the soil preserved the body sufficiently for their purpose. Under the early dynasties, parts of the whole or the dead body were wrapped in linen cloth, and before the end of the Old Kingdom, attempts were made to preserve it with natron or by covering it with plaster of some kind. Now, the interesting thing in the modern way is this formaldehyde and all this, and it makes the body look nicer for open casket funerals, but let's be real. The bones break up quicker. So the body actually goes away quicker instead of the bones being left, And the coffins give a space to collapse. People can get hurt because a coffin collapses and there's a dip in the ground, or maybe they step and there's an air packet, the ground doesn't hold them. The burial of bodies in the prenatal position was common under the first 3 or 4 dynasties, and then the custom arose of laying them on their backs and stretched out full length in their coffins. So this is a dry body in such a prenatal position from Gevelen, British Museum, 32,751. Now, I'm not certain, it doesn't seem right to just put people's dead bodies on display, leave them in their graves, do a archaeological investigation, mark it off as a grave that you just, leave the body alone or something, but this was probably due to the development of the cult of Yasur, the priest of which preached the resurrection of the body, with all its powers and members complete. They proclaimed that the body of Yasur, who was slain on the dike bents of Nadyit near Abdos, had been reconstituted and made incorruptible and immortal. Now, even though the Quran mentions that worms came and ate the staff of and ate at the staff of Solomon. Suleiman, Shroma was earlier names than when people called him Solomon. Well, Suleiman is the Arabic and an Aramaic version of it. But what? His body was perfect, but his worms were showing up? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. It's not about the body. And there's various other, there's another passage in the Quran. It's like, well, if he dies or is killed, it's like, same thing. But people get, they think the body's it. Or they say that, oh, something happened with the body after the person died, and must be a sign. Well, if the earth keeps throwing out the body, and you can't explain why the earth is throwing out the body, that's a different, that could be a different story. But, if the leg crosses one way or the other, or the body, if they dig up the grave and they don't know why the body is preserved or not preserved, there's various things that can explain some of those things. By treating the dead body of a man as that of Yusir had been treated by Yinpu, Anubis, Cyrus, a divine physician and embalmer, and reciting the spells of the Hotte that Yust had uttered, the priest proclaimed their power to enable it to rise from the dead and become immortal. The art of mummification reached its highest pitch of development under the 18th dynasty. And although from about 1300 BCE it steadfastly declined, mummification was practiced in Egypt till the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. And then later on, the Catholics and Protestants picked back up attempts to preserve bodies as part of their process. The religious texts show that many different views were current about the resurrection of the body. The material body was called, I thought it was chat, but kat, a word meaning something that decays. Corruption, etc. It's one of the 9 words of what people call the self. One view that the very substance of this corruptible body was remade and reborn by means of mummification, and by magical and religious spells that were recited properly by properly qualified priests, whilst the various processes were being carried out, and that the body of every man who appeared before Yustir was the actual body in which he lived upon earth,